I am a descendant of the most MIsnagdim house in Jewish annals. I was born into the house, into the Beis Harav, the house of the rabbis, the scholar, which traces its origin to the Lozhen and the Vilna Gaon. And I am a great-great-grandson of Chaim Volozhiner, the most outstanding disciple of the Gaon of Vilna, who was the chief opponent and adversary of Hasidus in general and Chabad in particular. Basically, the controversy, I may say not, it was not only a controversy, it was a struggle, a bitter struggle between the Goyen and the Alter Rebbe. He knew very little of general Hasidus, of Ukrainian Hasidus. But he apparently saw danger in the Chabad movement, which began to invade Lithuania and White Russia, the stronghold of MIsnagdim. You know all, even though perhaps it's out of context to mention it, on Yad Kislev, with the Gaon of Vilna, a year before his death, before he passed on to eternity, has condemned and excommunicated the Hasidic movement, particularly Chabad, in the strictest terms. You all, I don't, of course, Chabad Hasidim know, and Jena in MIsnagdim know, that the Goyen refused to meet with the Balatani. The legend, I don't know how Hassidim, the version which was adopted by Hassidim, but I can tell you the version which was adopted by MIsnagdim. The legend, and it might be a true history or a true story which corresponded to fact. The legend tells us that Alter Rebbe, came to Vilna accompanied by his mechutin. Of course, it was not a mechutin that time, but later it became his mechutin, Rav Soloveitchik. Even though he had been told, had been informed ahead of time that the Gaon will not receive him and that will not be welcome in the clois where the Gaon studied. He did, however, regardless of the anticipated unpleasant reception which awaited him, come, as I said, accompanied by his comrade in arms, and particularly, his Chaver, since the days of the MIsnagdim. As a matter of fact, Yad Kislev is a year of the MIsnagdim. I know about a great deal about Chabad. I'm a clandestine Chabadnik. because even though I am a member of the MIsnagdim family, I studied as a young child under a Chabad teacher, Melamed. Matter of fact, he was a descendant of Balatani, of Fabrengen, and he tried to implant in me, Hasidus as much as possible. He concentrated particularly on me. So about 100 boys in the many classes, but actually he concentrated on me, and he simply wanted to show brisk that one of the members has betrayed the tradition of the Gaon and joined Chabad. Whether he succeeded, you will judge after I conclude my speech. Yes, so together with his mechutin, and comrade in arms, and fellow preacher of Hasidus, and champion of the Hasidus Baal Shem Tov, presented themselves in the Beis HaMedrash of the Goyen and began to climb the staircase leading to the attic where the Goyen studied day and night. The Goyen, upon sensing that somebody is trying to intrude upon him, frightened to the very marrow of his bones, locked the door and barricaded himself. The Balatanya, Rav Yitzchak knocked on the door and asked permission to enter. They begged the Goyen Azure, or they called him the Chassid Azure. Basically, really was known not as the Goyen Azure, but the Chassid. The clothes, the Smedrish, where he davened, the Smedrish where he studied, was known in Vilna with the Chassid clothes, not the Goyen's clothes. The Chassid Azure, they said to him, we implore you, please open the door. We want to prove to you the unfounded charges were made against us. But Goyen, however, that's what the legend tells us, peeked through the crack in the door and saw the handsome, inspiring, spellbinding, and fascinating countenance of the Tanya. It's one of the finest countenances and faces I've ever seen in my life. In the story that when he was in prison in Petersburg, a leading, if I'm not mistaken, Rein, I believe, the leading artist painter of Russia, the leading artist painter of Russia, I believe his name was Rein, if I'm not mistaken, painted him. His portrait. And that's what do you have of the Tanya. I mean, if you have seen the picture of the Tanya, the Chayim of it, is actually the true portrait of him, because it was painted by an outstanding artist. I mean, without the Tanya, protested against. The story is that without the knowledge of the Tanya, he succeeded in painting his portrait. He saw the spellbinding, fascinating face of the Tanya, his exceptionally big forehead, these rounded out corners, and the deeply set, sparkling eyes, and the patriarchic beard. And he remarked to himself, I don't know who ever heard him say to himself, but this is his story. He remarked to himself, it's too much beauty. There's too much beauty to his face. There is too much magnetic power to his personality. I'm afraid if I'll open the door, I will not be able to withstand his charm. I'll yield to him, to his commanding eyes. If I should open the door, I believe he'll walk out with me and in heaven, both proclaiming and preaching Chabad. And he wants to seduce me. Let me free. And the story goes that the Gaon fled indeed through a window. His old mother helped him climb through the window. She put out the ladder and hid for several months in a small town called Kaidan, near Lund. The Gaon escaped from Vilna in order not to meet with the Balatanya, and with his flight from Vilna, the great vision of Bias HaMashiach has receded. Lithuanian Chabadnikas used to say, if the Gaon had opened the door, had the Tanya entered his attic, had they embraced each other, Moshiach would have arrived immediately. If these two titans, giants, had met, the Redeemer would have appeared in Vilna and joined them. Of course, I told you before, it it is hard now to discriminate between fact and fantasy in the story, between historic truth and legendary, trimmings or adornments. It's hard. However, my feeling is, and usually I heard a story from my father or from my mother, and she told me she had it from my grandfather. Usually the stories which have been on the handed on in Brisk, were more or less, corresponded more or less to facts. However, my feeling is, and as much as I could gather from my conversations with my father, my uncle, and other disciples of Alozhin, the salient parts of the story are more or less true. It is true that Agon, accompanied by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Badichver, came to Vilna, they knocked on the door. It's also true that the Gaon locked the door, barricaded himself, and when finally the door was opened, because people were frightened, he didn't answer. When the door was forced in and opened, so the Gaon was gone through the window, and that he spent a couple of months in the garden, being afraid to return to Vilna. The Rebbe Balatanya, he'll meet the Balatanya. And the Goyen, saw his face through a crack in the door. He was afraid he would not be able to resist this charm. This is the MIsnagdim version. What's your version? I don't know. And let me tell you, it was a bitter, ruthless struggle. Ruthless, cruel struggle. No pardon was asked, and none was given. The Gaon, a year and a half, or not even a year and a half, a year and a couple of months, excommunicated, condemned, and inconsiderately found Chabad guilty. And of course, guilty of treachery, apostasy, and events began to unfold posthumously after the Goyen had died, with an elemental force and tremendous speed, leading to the imprisonment of the Tanya Zechenu Vroche under charges of conspiring with a foreign power, Turkey, against Russia, and training young boys in the skills and the art of revolution. What the punishment for such crimes was at the turn of the 19th century, I do not have to tell you, it's still a horrible crime in Russia. And as I said before, it was a struggle between two titans, giants, head and shoulders above the average scholar in Lithuania. The Gaon was an intellectual giant of legendary fame. His authority in Lithuania was unlimited. He was actually the ruler of Lithuanian and White Russian Jewry. Word by the Gaon, he was in order for hundreds and thousands of Jews. That this titan, this giant, declared the war on another intellectual titan giant who was, as I said before, head and shoulders above his contemporaries. They both wrestled. Unfortunately, for no reason whatsoever. It was not only a titanic struggle, but it was a very tragic struggle. It was tragic because they concurred in many basic tenets. It's very strange. And views. It was tragic because it was not warranted. Since the area of agreement between the Goyen and the Tanya was by far larger than that of controversy. The area of concurrence actually was by far larger than that of contradiction. Reb Chaim Volozhner, we know very well that Reb Chaim Volozhner, of course, the book was published later, but the Goyen instructed Reb Chaim Volozhner to write the Nefesh HaChaim. Write the Nefesh HaChaim specifically to contradict and to refute the Tanya. This was the single objective which he had in mind while writing the book, simply to prove that the Tanya's philosophy is wrong, groundless without any foundation, and that the fundamentals of Hassidim, as they have been formulated by the Tanya, are contrary to the basic traditional Jewish view. What happened? Something very ironic and very strange. 75% of the ideas expressed in Tanya were not only not refuted by Reb Chaim Volozhner, but on the contrary, confirmed and accepted. For instance, the sensitive issue which raged that time about the relationship between Torah and Aveda, between Limud Torah and Tefillah, the relationship between study and prayer. Or, for instance, the problem of Yichudei Tatoy and Yichudei Elohe, to which the Tanya has dedicated devoted, the Shah Yichud Emunah in his Likutei Amorim. God is sustaining the world, God is actually pervading the world, and God transcendent to the world and remote and far from the world. Then the problem of centrality of man in the spiritual hierarchy, who were treated by Reb Chaim and by Reb Shlomo, by the Tanya in almost identical manner. Of course, you've got to understand there is individuality and uniqueness, not only to a face, but also to thought. Two great minds and two exalted, sensitive souls must think differently, express themselves differently in two singular ways, each coining his own terms, his own categories, forming his own conceptions. Chazal of old have said, Kishem shepartzifeim shel bnei Adam mishunei zeh meneh, kach de'eseim. There are no doubles as far as faces are concerned. There cannot be two identical views. Therefore, the casual reader who just casually read the Tanya, you have to study. He studies the Tanya and studies Nefesh HaChaim. He isn't used to think that the Nefesh HaChaim and the Tanya are worlds apart. Yet it is not so. It isn't. The differences and the incongruities are of marginal significance, mostly limited, to semantics and terminology. The central motifs are the same. Both, when portraying the focal role of Talmud Torah in our religious life, operate with the idea, if I just mention it, Ardus HaMaskil VaMuskal, which the Tanya has borrowed from the Rambam, from the Meir Nevuchim. I want you to know that Tanya was perhaps the first thinker who dared to quote the Meir Nevuchim. No one before him there. Reb Chaim doesn't do it. But the Tanya had the courage to quote the Meir Nevuchim and to say, when he quoted the Rambam, Ardus HaMaskil VaMuskal, Uledaite Iskimu Kol Chachmei HaKabbalah, he means the Kordevare, the Moshe Kordevare. And actually, this principle of Ardus HaMaskil VaMuskal plays in the Tanya a central role. Also, Reb Chaim, without mentioning the Rambam, the Meir Nevuchim, also speaks in similar terms. about the unity of the knower and the known subject. Both are cognizant of the unlimited opportunities confronting man. And both know that man's personality, of course, as Rav Soloveitchik says, if he can choose freely, his personality then will transcend the angels. And they also knew about tragic fall of man into the abyss of nihility. And both portray man as a part of the universe of creation, of nature, and as a singular being who communes separately with his maker. If you read the droshes of the Baal HaTanya for Rosh Hashanah in Kippur, particularly Rosh Hashanah droshes, how the man can use a shortcut, to the Rebbeinu Shalom. He does not have to approach him through the world, to Atzilus, to the Bria. But he had a direct approach to the Bria. And exactly the same thing is being expressed by the Nefesh HaChaim. Both knew of the method of zt'l Yesh, which plays such an important central role in Hasidus and Chabad, and the spiritual sacrifice with which tefillah is inseparably intertwined. In a word, they lived in the same religious, mystical world, and yet Chabad was denounced and excommunicated by the great teacher, seventh and saint, the Gaon of Vilna. The question arises, why? What brought it about? What brought it about? There is no doubt, I have no doubt about it, and you will agree with me, that a very significant contribution to the cause of Pirut Levores, for certain people it's a cause, Pirut Levores, splitting the Klal Yisrael and dividing the community into two hostile camps. This contribution was made by go-betweens, by troublemakers, slandermongers, ruthless and corrupt people, psychopaths, who find malicious delight in feud and the promotion of hate and bigotry. I don't want to mention names. I remember from my childhood years back, Yad Kislev arouses in my mind many memories. I look up on Yad Kislev with nostalgia, because as a child I used to celebrate Yad Kislev, because my father was rabbi in Kislev. Kislev was a fortress of Chabad Hasidus. There's an old song, I don't know whether you know how to sing it. Full Chaslavich, Kain Lebavich. Of course it says that he travels back and forth from Kislev and Lebavich and doesn't care for the whole world. Which expresses zt'l Yesh. Yes. And I must tell you, Hasidus in Kislev, the Hassidim of Kislev were great Talmidei Chachamim, great Yirei Hashem. But Kislev had a very strange tradition. I'm just getting off the track, but I want to tell you something. Kislev had a very strange tradition. The whole, I would say, district, which was not far from Smolensk and the Dnieper, was between the Surge and the Dnieper, was on the border separating the White Russia from Russia itself, was populated by Chabad. And Chabad had the finest London in those communities who were Hasidei Chabad, Hasidei Lubavitch. And it was a very strange, something very strange was, drew the attention of historians. All communities used to select or elect Hasidic rabbis. You know that in Chabad, the Rov never told us so far. Either that or not. Dayan Tzedek or never. Never the word Rav, was only in reserve for the Rebbe. Rav and Rebbe is So all communities around Kislev, Monastirchen and Petrovich and Kislev, and so forth, no mention have no MIsnagdim, but a Chabad dat from us. Kislev was the only town. Even though Kislev was the fortress of Hassidim, it was the only town which never has elected a Chabadnik as a Rav, as a dat from us. Only MIsnagdim. There was a tradition in Kislev that the Rav can only be a descendant of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, of the Beis Harav, or a Talmid, a disciple of Volozhiner Yeshiva.